She is just a guest. The coward who abandoned her squad, my father sneered as he introduced me to my sister's fiancé, a highly decorated Navy SEAL commander. Laughter rippled across the table. The commander reached out to politely shake my hand, but then his eyes caught the jagged scar across my wrist. He froze. His polite smile vanished, replaced by absolute shock. He snapped to attention and stammered, asking if I was the Black Panther of the Marine Corps. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever felt like an outcast in your own family. You will definitely want to hear how I served them the ultimate payback. My name is Riley, and I am 32 years old. For my entire life, my family treated me like a stain on their carefully curated portrait of perfection. My father, Richard, ran a logistics and shipping company that had been hemorrhaging money for years, though he maintained the illusion of massive wealth through sheer arrogance. My mother, Catherine, was a master of psychological manipulation, constantly pitting her children against one another to secure her own dominance. My older brother, Thomas, was greedy and lazy, perfectly content to ride my father's coattails while draining the company accounts. And then there was Stella, my 28-year-old sister, the undisputed golden child. She was a social media influencer whose entire existence revolved around expensive clothes, luxury vacations, and whatever advantageous relationship she could secure to fund her lifestyle. I was the exact opposite of everything they valued. I joined the military straight out of high school, seeking discipline, purpose, and most importantly, an escape from their toxic household. I served in the Marine Corps for 10 years, surviving deployments that tested the very limits of human endurance. When a catastrophic mission ended my military career and left me with extensive physical and emotional scars, I returned home hoping for a fraction of support. Instead, my family twisted the narrative of my medical discharge. Because the details of my final mission were highly classified, my father spun his own story to his high society friends. He claimed I had been dishonorably discharged for cowardice, that I had abandoned my post and run away when things got difficult. It was a lie that perfectly fit their view of me as the family failure. For the past 4 years, I had let them believe whatever they wanted. I rented a tiny, run-down studio apartment on the outskirts of Boston, wore simple clothes, and told them I worked night shifts as a security guard. They had no idea that after leaving the military, I had leveraged my tactical expertise and global connections to found Aegis Defense, a private defense contracting firm. Through relentless work and strategic acquisitions, Aegis had grown into an international powerhouse worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I was the anonymous CEO pulling the strings from the shadows, entirely self-made and completely free from their control. Tonight was Stella's grand engagement party at the most exclusive luxury hotel in downtown Boston. She had recently secured the ultimate prize in her eyes, a handsome, highly respected Navy SEAL commander named David. David was an African-American man with a commanding presence, a brilliant strategic mind, and a reputation for absolute integrity. I had honestly wondered how someone of his caliber had fallen for my sister's superficial charms, but Stella was an expert at playing the sweet, supportive partner when it suited her agenda. The ballroom was a sea of crystal chandeliers, imported orchids, and Boston's wealthiest elite. My parents had spared no expense, likely putting the entire event on credit to impress David's prestigious military colleagues and our extended family. I had been invited purely as an afterthought, an obligation they felt forced to fulfill. Upon arriving, I was immediately directed away from the main floor. My mother had assigned me to table 14, a small, dimly lit table tucked directly next to the swinging kitchen doors. My dining companions for the evening were my father's chauffeur, the hotel's coat check attendant, and 2 of the catering staff who were on their break. I sat there quietly, in my simple black suit, sipping sparkling water, and watching the spectacle unfold. I did not mind the seating arrangement. The catering staff were genuinely lovely people, far more interesting conversationalists than my pretentious relatives. From my vantage point, I watched my father parade David around the room like a trophy. Richard puffed out his chest, introducing his future son-in-law to every wealthy investor and socialite in attendance, clearly hoping to use David's military prestige to boost his own failing company's reputation. Eventually, their grand tour brought them toward the back of the room. Stella was clinging to David's arm, her diamond ring catching the light as she laughed a little too loudly at a joke someone made. As they passed table 14, David paused, his sharp eyes scanned the shadows and landed on me. Perhaps he noticed a slight familial resemblance, or perhaps his military training simply made him hyper-aware of his surroundings. He stopped walking and turned toward my father, gesturing politely in my direction. He asked if I was part of the family, noting that I was sitting entirely alone with the hotel staff while sharing my father's distinctive jawline. Richard let out a harsh, dismissive bark of laughter. His voice was entirely too loud, clearly meant to draw the attention of the neighboring tables. He waved his hand at me as if swatting away an annoying insect. He told David that I was just a guest, an unfortunate family obligation. He sneered, calling me the coward who had abandoned her squad when the gunfire got too heavy. He told David I was a disgrace to the uniform and a stain on the family name. Thomas, my older brother, had wandered over with a glass of scotch in his hand. He chuckled meanly, adding that I was the reason they did not talk about military service in our house. Stella leaned against David's shoulder, batting her eyelashes in a perfect display of manufactured pity. She told David not to mind me claiming I just worked as a lowly security guard at some warehouse, and that I was always making up stories to sound important. The cruelty of their words washed over me, familiar and exhausting. This was their favorite game, tearing me down to build themselves up. I did not react. I simply reached across the table to pick up my glass of ice water. As I extended my arm, the cuff of my black blazer slid up slightly, exposing the inside of my left wrist. Etched into my skin was a massive, jagged scar. An unnatural, serrated burn mark shaped like a crescent moon. It was a distinct injury, the result of a specialized incendiary shrapnel blast that only happened in very specific combat zones. David had reached out his hand to offer me a polite, sympathetic greeting, but his eyes caught the scar. His entire body froze. The polite, accommodating smile vanished from his face instantly. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees as his posture shifted from relaxed civilian to hardened military commander. His pupils dilated as he stared at my wrist, then slowly brought his gaze up to meet my eyes. He stood rigidly at attention, his heels snapping together subtly. His voice trembled slightly, losing all its previous warmth, replaced by a tone of absolute shock and profound respect. He addressed me as ma'am, stumbling over his words as he asked if I was the operative known as the Black Panther of the Marine Corps. Thomas choked on his scotch, bursting into a loud, obnoxious fit of laughter. He clapped David on the shoulder, wiping a tear from his eye. He told David that was a hilarious joke, thanking him for putting me in my place. Richard joined in, grinning broadly, praising David for mocking my fake military career. David did not laugh. He did not even crack a smile. He turned his head slowly to look at my brother, and the lethal intensity in his eyes made Thomas's laughter die instantly in his throat. David's voice boomed across the quiet corner of the ballroom, sharp and commanding, drawing the attention of dozens of guests. He demanded to know who Thomas thought he was calling a coward. He stepped toward my brother, towering over him, radiating an intimidating fury. He pointed a finger directly at me, his voice echoing off the walls. He told my family that I was the legend who stayed behind in the Korangal Valley. He explained with raw emotion in his voice that my squad of 6 had been ambushed and pinned down by 50 heavily armed insurgents. He shouted that I had ordered the evacuation, manually detonating the bridge to cut off the enemy advance, and held the line entirely alone for 4 agonizing hours so my team could escape to the extraction point. The entire ballroom had gone deathly silent. Guests had stopped eating their forks hovering midair. The string quartet in the corner faltered and stopped playing. David was breathing heavily now, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. He told my father that I took 2 bullets and a piece of incendiary shrapnel to the wrist to ensure my squad made it home to their families. He declared that my call sign was spoken with absolute reverence in every tactical operations center in the country. The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard's mouth hung open in shock. Thomas took a physical step backward, looking terrified by the furious SEAL commander standing before him. Stella looked frantically around the room, realizing that the spotlight had shifted entirely away from her engagement and onto my military record. My mother, Catherine, was the first to recover. She scurried over her heels, clicking rapidly against the marble floor. She forced a bright, artificial laugh, waving her hands as if to clear the air. She touched David's arm gently, utilizing her best gaslighting tone. She told David he must be mistaken, claiming that I read too many spy novels and that I was deeply troubled. She assured him I told tall tales for attention and that my discharge was purely due to psychological instability. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile, her eyes full of venom, silently demanding that I back down and accept her narrative. I did not say a word. I did not need to defend myself against their pathetic attempts at manipulation. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a heavy, matte black challenge coin. It was solid metal, cold and weighty, engraved with a highly classified insignia. I tossed it casually onto the white tablecloth. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that seemed to echo in the silent room. David stared down at the coin. All the blood drained from his face. He recognized the insignia immediately. It was the mark of the Supreme Commander, a limited edition coin given only to operatives with the absolute highest security clearance in the nation, individuals who reported directly to the upper echelons of the Pentagon. It was proof not only of my past valor, but of my current, terrifyingly high status. Stella could not handle it anymore. The sight of her prestigious fiancé staring at me with absolute awe shattered her fragile ego. She stomped her foot, tears of genuine frustration spilling over her carefully applied makeup. She shrieked that I was ruining her special day, accusing me of purposely causing a scene to steal her thunder. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing loudly, playing the victim with practiced perfection. Richard immediately wrapped his arms around his golden child, glaring at me with a hatred so pure it was almost impressive. He pointed a trembling finger toward the exit. He told me to get out of his sight. He screamed that I was a disruptive, toxic influence, banning me from the wedding, banning me from the family, and demanding I never show my face near them again. I looked at his red, furious face, then at my mother, who was comforting a sobbing Stella, and finally at Thomas, who was hiding behind them all. This was the family that was supposed to love me. This was the bloodline I shared. I stood up, slowly smoothing the wrinkles from my blazer. I picked up my challenge coin, slipped it back into my pocket, and gave David a brief, respectful nod. I did not offer a single word of defense or apology to my parents. I simply turned on my heel and walked toward the exit, my head held high, my footsteps echoing against the marble. As I walked out of the grand ballroom, a profound sense of déjà vu washed over me. I remembered being 18 years old, dragging a duffel bag out the front door of our suburban home. That day, Catherine had demanded I surrender the funds from my hard-earned academic scholarship to pay off Thomas's massive fraternity debts. When I refused, Richard had thrown me out into the rain, telling me I was a selfish disgrace who would never amount to anything without his money. They had tried to break me then, and they were trying to break me now. But they failed to realize that the scared 18-year-old girl was long gone. I was 32 now. I had survived mortar fire, betrayals, and the brutal trenches of international business. I did not need them. I had built Aegis Defense from the ground up. I had power they could not even begin to comprehend. I pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors of the hotel and stepped out into the crisp Boston night air. The valet rushed forward to retrieve my car, but before he could reach me, the general manager of the hotel came sprinting out the doors. He was a distinguished man in a tailored suit, but right now he was sweating profusely, completely out of breath. He bypassed the valet and stopped directly in front of me, bowing at the waist. He addressed me as boss, his voice trembling slightly with anxiety. He apologized for interrupting my departure and asked nervously how they should handle the billing for Mr. Richards' engagement banquet this evening. I looked back at the glowing windows of the ballroom where my family was currently drinking expensive champagne and celebrating my expulsion. My lips curled into a cold, sharp smile. I told the manager to triple the cost of the venue rental. I instructed him to freeze my father's corporate credit line immediately and demand payment in full before they were allowed to leave the premises. The manager nodded vigorously, assuring me it would be done without hesitation. I tipped the valet, slid into the driver's seat of my car, and drove away from the family that had just discarded me for the last time. They thought they had humiliated a helpless security guard. They had no idea they had just declared war on the owner of the hotel and the very person holding the keys to their financial destruction. The morning sun barely pierced the single, grime-covered window of the decoy apartment I maintained on the outskirts of Boston. I sat on the edge of the cheap, sagging mattress, sipping black coffee, as I scrolled through my personal phone. My family had not wasted a single second playing the victim. Stella had uploaded a highly produced, tear-streaked video to her millions of followers. She sat on the edge of her pristine white sofa, wearing an oversized pastel sweater to look fragile and small, delicately dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. She spoke to the camera with a trembling voice, claiming her magical engagement night had been hijacked by a deeply disturbed, toxic relative. She spun a beautiful, tragic narrative for her audience. She told her followers that this estranged family member suffered from severe psychological delusions and had burst into the private, expensive event just to cause a scene and seek attention. She cried about how hard it was to love someone who refused to get psychiatric help. She claimed her strong, brave fiancé, David, had been forced to step in and protect her from this unhinged woman. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. She conveniently omitted the part where David, the highly decorated Navy SEAL commander, had stood at attention and saluted me. She left out the challenge coin, my real military record, and the absolute terror on our father's face when his lies were exposed to his future son-in-law. The comments section beneath her video was a cesspool of manufactured sympathy. Thousands of strangers were calling me a psycho, a jealous spinster, a complete menace who could not handle seeing her younger sister find true love. Stella replied to the top comments with heart emojis, thanking her fans for their prayers and mentioning how she might need to book a luxury wellness retreat to recover from the severe emotional trauma of the evening. I turned off the screen and tossed the phone onto the worn laminate counter. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. I only felt a cold, clinical anticipation. My family was playing checkers in the mud, completely unaware that I was orchestrating a war from the sky. I walked to the closet and pushed aside the row of faded flannel shirts and cheap jeans I wore whenever I was forced to visit them and play the part of the struggling outcast. Behind a false panel in the back of the closet, my real world awaited. I pulled out a custom-tailored charcoal suit, slipped on a pair of designer heels, and strapped a platinum watch to my wrist, carefully covering the jagged scar that had caused so much chaos the night before. I left the dreary apartment, walked 2 blocks to a private, secure parking garage, and slid into the driver's seat of my matte black luxury sedan. The drive into the heart of the financial district took exactly 20 minutes. I pulled into the underground VIP parking of a towering glass skyscraper that pierced the Boston skyline. This was the global headquarters of Aegis Defense. I bypassed the main lobby entirely, stepping into a private, reinforced steel elevator that required a retinal scan to operate. The doors slid closed, isolating me from the noise of the city, and I ascended to the top floor. The atmosphere on the executive floor was a world away from the pathetic social climbing and petty drama of my family. It was a hub of military-grade efficiency, combined with vast corporate wealth. Analysts in sharp suits moved with urgent purpose. Security personnel, all former Special Forces operatives, gave me crisp, respectful nods as I walked down the corridor. My family had spent the previous night calling me a lowly security guard. They had no idea that I employed an entire army of the most elite security professionals on the planet. Here I was, not a disappointment. I was the absolute authority. My executive assistant Naomi fell into step beside me as I approached my corner office. She was a brilliant tactician in her own right, holding a secure tablet and reading off the morning briefing with rapid-fire precision. She updated me on our overseas operations, the status of our latest international defense contracts, and the quarterly revenue projections that were shattering previous records. As I sat behind my massive mahogany desk overlooking the sprawling city below, Naomi placed a thick red folder right in the center of my blotter. She informed me that we had a situation regarding the new $50 million domestic logistics subcontract. We needed a civilian shipping fleet to transport non-lethal supplies across the country, and the bidding process was supposed to be highly selective and discreet. Naomi tapped the red folder, her expression turning slightly disgusted. She explained that a local transportation company had been calling the front desk incessantly since 6 in the morning. The CEO of this company was practically begging for a chance to present a pitch to our board. Naomi noted that he was acting incredibly entitled, screaming at the reception staff, demanding to speak directly to the CEO of Aegis, and claiming he was a vital pillar of the Boston business community. She told me she had run a preliminary audit on the company just to see who was making such a fuss, and their financials were an absolute disaster. The company was heavily leveraged, drowning in bad debt and bleeding capital at an alarming rate. Furthermore, as of late last night, their primary corporate credit lines had been mysteriously frozen. They were weeks, maybe days away from total bankruptcy. This $50 million contract was not just a business opportunity for them. It was a desperate lifeline. I reached out and flipped open the cover of the folder. Staring back at me was the corporate logo of my father's shipping company. Richard was the desperate, screaming CEO blowing up my company's phone lines. He was drowning in the financial ruin he had secretly created to fund my mother and sister's extravagant lifestyles. He had no idea that the massive, faceless defense contractor he was begging for salvation was owned and operated by the very daughter he had humiliated and banished just 12 hours prior. Naomi watched me study the file. She asked if she should toss the application in the shredder. She pointed out that Aegis Defense did not partner with failing civilian firms, let alone ones run by men who verbally abused receptionists on recorded lines. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the sheer poetry of the situation wash over me. I looked up at Naomi and smiled a cold, razor-sharp expression that made her pause. I told her not to throw it away. I instructed her to call my father's company back immediately and invite them to the open bidding presentations tomorrow morning. I wanted them to build their hopes up to the absolute highest peak. I wanted them to walk into this building believing they had just saved their pathetic empire right before I kicked the ladder out from under them. By 6 o'clock that evening, I had swapped my tailored charcoal suit for a faded gray hoodie and worn-out jeans. I parked my luxury sedan in the secure garage and walked the 2 blocks back to my decoy apartment. The timing was perfect. I had barely poured myself a glass of tap water when a sharp, aggressive pounding echoed against my flimsy front door. The rattling of the loose hinges told me exactly who it was. I opened the door to find Richard, Catherine, and Stella standing in the dimly lit hallway. The corridor smelled faintly of old cooking oil and damp carpets, a stark contrast to the heavy, expensive perfumes my mother and sister wore. They looked entirely out of place. They clutched their designer coats tight against their bodies, casting disgusted looks at the peeling wallpaper, as if the very air in my building might infect them with poverty. Richard pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, stepping his polished Italian leather shoes onto my cracked linoleum floor. Catherine followed, running a manicured finger over the edge of a cheap laminate counter and wiping the imaginary dust on her expensive skirt with a dramatic sigh. Stella stayed near the door, holding a scented tissue over her nose, looking at my sparse furnishings with absolute revulsion. Nobody offered an apology for the horrific display at the engagement party. Nobody asked how I was doing or apologized for throwing me out in front of hundreds of people. To them, my feelings were entirely irrelevant. I was not a person. I was a tool they had temporarily misplaced and now needed to use again. Richard turned to face me, his chest puffed out with that familiar, hollow arrogance. He pointed a finger at my chest and told me I had caused enough damage for one lifetime, but today he was feeling generous. He said he was going to give me a chance to make up for my psychotic behavior from the night before. I crossed my arms and leaned against the counter, keeping my expression perfectly blank. I asked him what exactly he wanted from me. Stella dropped her tissue and glared at me. Her face flushed with anger. She shrieked that David was not returning any of her calls. She blamed me entirely, claiming my crazy military delusion act had completely spooked him. She said David had texted her, saying he needed time to process what had happened at the party, and now she was terrified she was going to lose the most prestigious catch of her life. She stamped her foot and demanded that I fix it immediately. Richard held up a hand to silence her, stepping closer to me. His eyes were wide, with a manic, desperate energy that he was trying terribly hard to hide. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. He explained that his logistics company had secured a pitch meeting tomorrow morning with Aegis Defense for a $50 million contract. He puffed out his chest and bragged that he had personally secured the meeting through his own brilliant business acumen, completely unaware that I had been the one to approve his application just hours earlier. He then laid out his absurd demand. He told me I was going to call David right now. I was going to apologize to the SEAL commander for my disruptive behavior, confess that I had made up the entire story about my military record to get attention, and beg for his forgiveness. Once David was calmed down, I was to sweet-talk him into using his high-level military connections to put in a good word for our family with the executives at Aegis Defense. The sheer audacity of the request was staggering. They wanted me to humiliate myself, deny my own literal blood and sweat, and manipulate a highly decorated military commander, all to save the shipping company Richard had single-handedly driven into the ground. Furthermore, Richard was foolish enough to believe that David could just make a phone call to influence an Aegis Defense contract. Aegis did not work like that. I had built my company to be incorruptible. Before I could even respond to Richard's ridiculous demands, Catherine stepped forward. She put on her best maternal voice, the one dripping with toxic, suffocating manipulation. She looked around my tiny, dreary apartment and sighed theatrically, shaking her head, as if looking at a tragic mistake. She told me that this family raised me, fed me, and put clothes on my back, and now it was time for me to pay my debt. She said that if I behaved, if I swallowed my pride and fixed this mess with David so they could win the Aegis contract, she would personally do me a massive favor. She promised to convince my father to give me a janitorial job at his company. She smiled a sickly sweet smile and added that I would not have to live in this filth anymore if I just remembered my place and served the family. It took every ounce of my military discipline not to burst out laughing right in her face. The woman standing before me, drowning in secret debt and wearing clothes she could no longer afford, was offering the CEO of a multi-million-dollar defense conglomerate a job scrubbing toilets. I looked at the three of them. Richard trembling with hidden financial panic, Stella furious that she was losing her grip on a man she did not deserve, Catherine clinging desperately to a matriarchal power she never truly possessed. They were so blinded by their own narcissism that they could not see the cliff edge right in front of them. I lowered my eyes, forcing my shoulders to slump. I played the part of the defeated, broken daughter they so desperately needed me to be. I kept my voice quiet and submissive. I told them they were right. I said I owed the family everything. I promised I would not cause any more trouble. Richard smiled, a greasy, triumphant expression spreading across his face. He patted my cheek condescendingly, telling me it was about time I grew up and became useful. I looked up at him, injecting just the right amount of eagerness into my voice. I promised him that I would absolutely lend a hand at the Aegis Defense bidding tomorrow morning. I assured him I would be there in person to make sure everything went exactly the way it was supposed to. Catherine beamed, adjusting her designer scarf. She told me to dress appropriately for once, perhaps something that did not make me look like a vagrant. Stella rolled her eyes and muttered that I was probably going to embarrass them again, but Richard shushed her. He had what he came for. They turned and marched out of my decoy apartment, their heads held high, strutting back down the dingy hallway like conquering royalty. They left feeling victorious, completely unaware that they had just handed the executioner the very rope that would hang them. I locked the flimsy door of my decoy apartment the second my family's footsteps faded down the hall. The air still reeked of my mother's overpowering perfume, a cloying reminder of their sheer audacity. I had barely turned away from the door when my secure mobile device vibrated in my pocket. It was not my standard civilian phone, but the highly encrypted line I reserved strictly for Aegis Defense executives and top-tier government contacts. I pulled the device out and frowned at the incoming caller ID. It was a secure military line, routed directly through the Pentagon's communication grid. I swiped to accept the call, bringing the phone to my ear. It was David. His deep, commanding voice carried a heavy weight of exhaustion and genuine remorse. He addressed me by my former rank, a sign of absolute, undeniable respect. He apologized profusely for the events at the engagement party. He told me he had spent the last 24 hours digging into the actual details of my medical discharge, pulling strings to read the heavily redacted incident reports that confirmed exactly what I had sacrificed in the Korengal Valley. He expressed his absolute disgust at how my own blood relatives had treated me, calling their willful blindness unforgivable. David did not just call to apologize. He had actionable intelligence. He explained that after leaving the hotel, he grew highly suspicious of my father's frantic networking attempts and the way Stella had immediately tried to play the victim. The illusion of the perfect, wealthy family was shattering right before his eyes. David had used his own military clearance to run a quiet background check on Richard's logistics company. What he found made his blood boil. Richard was actively exploiting David's status as a Navy SEAL commander, dropping his name in closed-door meetings to fraudulently reassure investors and creditors that lucrative military defense contracts were practically guaranteed. My father was using the prestige of a man he barely knew to orchestrate a massive financial scam, leveraging a fake military connection to keep his sinking ship afloat. David's voice turned lethal over the phone. He told me he was prepared to absolutely obliterate Richard's operation. He offered to publicly denounce my father, file a formal military grievance for unauthorized use of his name, and personally ensure that my family never showed their faces in polite society again. He wanted to march into Richard's office, expose the fraud to the authorities, and tear his pathetic empire to the ground on my behalf. He even mentioned reconsidering his entire relationship with Stella, realizing she was deeply complicit in this toxic web of lies. I listened to the commander's righteous anger, appreciating the fierce loyalty of a fellow service member. It was a rare and validating comfort to hear a man of his caliber ready to go to war for my honor. It had been years since anyone had stood up for me, but I did not need a knight in shining armor to fight my battles. I had forged my own armor a long time ago in the fires of combat and corporate warfare. I was not a damsel in distress, waiting for a man to rescue me from my wicked family. I was the architect of their impending doom. I thanked David for his integrity and his willingness to step into the line of fire. Then I firmly declined his offer. I told him that my father's destruction required a much more precise and devastating tactical strike than a simple public denunciation. If David exposed him now, Richard would just declare bankruptcy and play the victim, crying to his high society friends that a cruel military man had ruined him. I told David that this was my war to fight, and I had been carefully positioning my chess pieces for years. I advised him to keep his hands clean, maintain his pristine military reputation, and play along with their delusion just a little while longer. I smiled a cold, dangerous smile into the phone. I told him, "Thank you, Commander, but this is my war. You just need to bring popcorn and watch the show." David paused the tactical silence stretching over the encrypted line. He recognized the tone of a superior officer executing a flawless operation. He let out a low, respectful chuckle, agreeing to stand down and observe. He promised to be front and center for whatever spectacle I had planned, eager to see how the legendary Black Panther handled domestic warfare. We ended the call with a mutual understanding forged in the shared experience of combat strategy. I did not waste another second in that depressing studio apartment. I packed up my secure phone, slipped out the back exit of the building, and drove straight back to the towering glass sanctuary of Aegis Defense Headquarters. The city was quiet, draped in the dark velvet of midnight, but my executive floor was always operational. I bypassed my main office and headed directly for the subterranean levels, swiping my biometric security badge to enter the reinforced document vault. The room was a fortress of steel and retinal scanners, housing the most sensitive financial audits and background checks of every corporation that dared to do business with Aegis Defense. It was a sterile, brightly lit room where corporate fates were decided. My chief financial auditor was waiting for me at a massive stainless steel table. He stood beside a towering stack of heavily flagged documents, looking incredibly serious. He handed me a silver fountain pen as I approached the table. I opened the thick red file containing the complete financial autopsy of my father's logistics company. The audit revealed a labyrinth of deceit. There were hidden offshore bank accounts, forged tax documents, shell companies used to hide massive debts, and fraudulent investor reports that my father had filed over the past decade. It was a house of cards, built on arrogance and greed. My parents and sister had walked into my decoy apartment just hours ago, demanding I swallow my pride, apologize to David, and beg for their favor. They had offered me a job scrubbing toilets in exchange for securing their financial salvation. They had no idea they had just demanded a favor from the one woman holding the absolute legal power to authorize their financial execution. I picked up the silver pen, my eyes scanning the damning evidence of my family's relentless greed. I signed my name on the dotted line with a sharp, decisive stroke. With that single signature, I officially initiated the relentless, unstoppable audit that would bring their fraudulent empire crashing down to the earth. The trap was set. The bait was taken, and tomorrow morning they were going to walk right into the jaws of the beast. The morning sun glared off the polished obsidian floors of the Aegis Defense main lobby. It was exactly 8 o'clock, and the ground floor of my skyscraper was a symphony of disciplined, quiet power. Armed security contractors stood at precise intervals, their posture rigid, their eyes scanning the massive glass atrium. Employees moved with purpose, speaking in hushed, efficient tones. This was not a place for the weak or the unprepared. This was a fortress built for the apex predators of the corporate and military world. I stood in the far corner of the expansive lobby, perfectly blending into the sleek, modern shadows cast by a towering steel pillar. I wore a minimalist, razor-sharp black suit, with no name tag and no identifying credentials. To an untrained eye, I looked like a mid-level assistant, or perhaps a member of the anonymous security detail. To the armed guard stationed 20 feet away, I was the absolute authority of their universe. I had given strict orders to the lobby personnel earlier that morning. No one was to acknowledge my presence. No one was to salute, bow, or refer to me by my title. I was simply a ghost, waiting for my targets to step into the kill zone. At exactly 8:15, the massive revolving glass doors at the front entrance began to spin. The silence of the pristine lobby was immediately shattered by the loud, obnoxious voices of my family. They walked in like they owned this city, projecting an artificial confidence that was almost painful to witness. Richard led the pack, wearing a suit that was far too flashy and tailored a decade too late. He strutted across the black marble, puffing out his chest and barking orders at Thomas, who scrambled to keep up while clutching a leather briefcase. Thomas looked entirely out of his depth, his eyes darting nervously around the imposing, militaristic architecture of the building. He held a half-empty cup of expensive artisanal coffee in his free hand, gripping it like a security blanket. Catherine and Stella trailed close behind them. I had to suppress a cold laugh at their sheer audacity. Richard was allegedly here for a life-or-death $50 million corporate defense pitch, yet he had brought his wife and daughter along, as if this were a family outing to the country club. Catherine was draped in designer labels that I knew from my financial audit were entirely unpaid for. Stella was holding her phone high in the air, recording the armed guards and the towering glass ceilings for her social media followers. She flipped her hair and spun in a circle, narrating to her camera about how her brilliant father was about to secure a massive government contract. They were bleeding millions of dollars, drowning in fraudulent debt, and standing on the absolute precipice of federal prison. Yet here they were, performing their sickening pantomime of extreme wealth and success. I remained perfectly still in the shadows, my hands clasped behind my back, observing their micro-expressions. I could see the heavy beads of sweat forming at the base of my father's neck. I noticed the slight, uncontrollable tremor in my brother's hands as he adjusted his expensive silk tie. They were terrified. The facade of arrogance was a thin, brittle shell, cracking under the immense pressure of their hidden financial ruin. As they marched toward the main reception desk, Thomas turned his head to scan the seating area. His eyes swept past the steel pillar and landed directly on me. He stopped dead in his tracks. A cruel, delighted grin spread across his face, entirely replacing his previous anxiety. He tapped Richard on the shoulder and pointed a finger in my direction. The entire family changed their trajectory, marching straight toward my dark corner of the lobby. Their posture shifted instantly from nervous desperation to predatory arrogance. Finding me here, standing quietly in a plain black suit, gave them the perfect opportunity to assert their dominance and inflate their fragile egos before their big meeting. Thomas reached me first. He looked me up and down with absolute disgust, his lips curling into a vicious sneer. He asked if I had actually taken our mother's advice and come crawling for a job scrubbing toilets. He laughed, a loud barking sound that echoed inappropriately in the quiet, disciplined lobby. Catherine stepped forward, adjusting her diamond necklace with a look of manufactured pity. She sighed heavily, telling me that it was good to see I finally understood my place in the world. She warned me to keep my head down, mop the floors quietly, and try not to cause any severe psychological disturbances around the real professionals who worked in this building. Stella did not even bother to lower her phone. She pointed the camera lens right at my face, giggling, as she told her followers that even the biggest failures in the family could eventually find honest work taking out the trash. I did not say a word. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. In the Marines, they teach you how to endure extreme psychological pressure without breaking your composure. My family was trying to trigger a reaction, hoping I would yell or cry so they could feel superior. I simply stared at them, my eyes flat and cold, letting their insults wash over me like rain against a titanium wall. My silence only infuriated Thomas further. He stepped directly into my personal space, invading my zone in a pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. He shoved his half-empty lukewarm coffee cup aggressively against my chest. He told me to make myself useful for once in my pathetic life. He ordered me to throw his garbage away and then get the hell out of his sight so her brilliant older brother could focus on doing big things. He warned me not to linger near the executive elevators, claiming I would only embarrass them if the Aegis executives saw me loitering like a stray dog. Richard checked his platinum watch and snapped his fingers at Thomas, telling him to stop wasting time on the hired help. My father glared at me, his eyes full of pure venom. He explicitly commanded me to vanish into whatever basement maintenance closet I belonged in until their presentation was over. They turned their backs on me, their egos fully inflated, their false confidence completely restored by tearing me down. They marched back toward the main reception desk, adjusting their expensive suits and preparing to demand entry to the boardroom. I looked down at the soggy paper coffee cup in my hand. I felt the lukewarm liquid sloshing against the cardboard. I did not feel humiliated. I did not feel small. I felt the chilling electric thrill of a predator watching its prey step directly onto the trigger plate of a landmine. I walked slowly toward the stainless steel trash receptacle positioned near the pillar. I tossed the cup inside. It hit the bottom with a hollow, satisfying thud. I raised my left hand to my ear, pressing a single finger against the discreet encrypted communication piece hidden beneath my hair. I spoke in a quiet, deadly calm voice that was transmitted directly to the heavy security detail monitoring the reception desk and the executive boardroom access doors. I gave the command to let the candidates into meeting room 1. Across the vast lobby, the massive frosted bulletproof glass doors guarding the inner sanctum of the executive wing hissed open in perfect synchronization. The armed guards stepped aside, clearing the path. Richard, Catherine, Thomas, and Stella straightened their spines. They shared a triumphant, greedy look with one another. They believed they were walking into a room full of naive, easily manipulated investors. They believed they were about to secure their financial salvation. They strutted through the imposing glass doors, stepping blindly into the abyss, completely and utterly oblivious that the very sister they had just ordered to take out the trash was the one pulling the lever on the guillotine. Meeting room 1 was not designed to put guests at ease. It was a tactical briefing center disguised as a corporate boardroom. The walls were lined with dark acoustic paneling, and the massive conference table was carved from a single slab of black walnut. At the head of the table sat 5 of my top executives, all former high-ranking military officers and elite financial strategists. They sat perfectly still, their expressions unreadable, flanked by digital displays showing redacted global maps and shifting data streams. I slipped into the room just as the heavy glass doors sealed shut behind my family. I moved silently along the back wall and took a position in the far corner, folding my hands behind my back. In my plain black suit, I melted into the shadows, observing the theater of the absurd that was about to unfold. Richard and Thomas marched up to the presentation podium, their false confidence already wavering under the icy, unnerving stares of the Aegis Executive Board. They fumbled with their briefcases, their hands shaking slightly as they distributed their glossy, fabricated portfolios to the board members. Catherine and Stella took seats in the plush observer chairs against the side wall. They crossed their legs in unison, attempting to project an aura of effortless high society. Stella even had the audacity to pull out a compact mirror checking her lipstick as if she were waiting for a fashion show to begin, rather than a federal-level defense bidding process. My chief operating officer, a formidable man named General Harrison, sat at the center of the executive panel. He glanced down at the glossy folder Richard had handed him, not bothering to open it. He looked up, his piercing gray eyes locking onto my father. He instructed Richard to begin. Richard cleared his throat, adjusting his tie one last time. He launched into his presentation with the practiced cadence of a desperate car salesman. He clicked a remote, and the massive digital screen behind him lit up with heavily doctored charts and stock images of smiling truck drivers. He spoke grandly about his logistics company, painting a picture of a robust, deeply honorable enterprise. He lied with pathological ease. He spun tales of unbroken supply chains, massive liquid capital, and a corporate culture built on generations of unwavering family trust and moral integrity. He claimed his fleet was ready to mobilize at a moment's notice to serve the nation's defense needs. I watched my executives exchange subtle, microscopic glances. They had all read the brutal financial audit I authorized last night. They knew Richard was drowning in fraudulent debt, hiding offshore accounts and facing imminent bankruptcy. Listening to him boast about his financial stability was like watching a man standing on a sinking ship, talking about how much he loved the view. Then, Richard played what he believed was his ultimate trump card. He puffed out his chest, leaning over the podium with a conspiratorial, arrogant smile. He lowered his voice, adopting a tone of exclusive privilege. He told the board that his family was intimately connected to the military elite. He proudly announced that his daughter, pointing a manicured hand toward Stella, was newly engaged to David, a highly decorated African-American Navy SEAL commander. Richard practically weaponized David's name, throwing it onto the table as a guarantee of his company's patriotic dedication. He assured the Aegis executives that having a SEAL commander in the family meant his business operated with the highest level of tactical precision and loyalty. He promised that David personally vouched for their logistics capabilities and their flawless moral character. In my shadowy corner, my jaw tightened. The sheer disrespect of using a man of David caliber as a shield for corporate fraud was nauseating. David had earned his prestige through blood sacrifice and unbreakable honor. Richard was trying to trade on that honor to secure a desperate $50 million lifeline to save his own skin. Thomas jumped in, eager to echo his father's lies. He smirked at the board, adding that their family took security and military values very seriously. He claimed they weeded out weakness and incompetence at every level, both in their business and in their personal lives. He boasted that their family only tolerated the absolute best. As Thomas spoke the word incompetence, Richard's eyes darted around the room to emphasize the point. That was when his gaze landed on me, standing quietly in the back corner. A vicious, opportunistic light flashed in my father's eyes. He saw a perfect chance to assert his dominance, to show these powerful executives that he was an alpha male who demanded excellence and did not tolerate mediocrity. He decided to use the lowly janitor he thought I was as a live prop for his presentation. Richard stopped his prepared speech. He pointed a rigid, accusatory finger directly across the boardroom at me. He let out a condescending sigh, shaking his head as he looked back at the executive panel. He told General Harrison that if Aegis Defense truly valued excellence, they needed to clean house immediately. He claimed that having a useless, insubordinate employee loitering in a high-level briefing was a massive security risk and a profound insult to important guests like himself. He loudly advised the board to fire me on the spot to prove they were serious about their corporate standards. Catherine chimed in from the observer chairs, letting out a haughty, delicate laugh. She told the executives not to let my pathetic presence distract them from the real business at hand. She claimed I was a troubled individual who was clearly unfit for any professional environment, suggesting I had likely wandered into the room just to cause trouble or beg for handouts. Stella scoffed loudly, crossing her arms and glaring at me. She told the board that I was a complete embarrassment and that they really needed to upgrade their security staff if they let useless people like me wander around the executive floors. She said it was a bad look for a company handling government money. Richard nodded in enthusiastic agreement with his wife and daughter. He leaned heavily on the podium, locking eyes with General Harrison. He stated firmly that his company only hired the absolute best, and he strongly recommended that Aegis terminate my employment before my sheer incompetence dragged their prestigious corporation down into the mud. He demanded that I be escorted out of the room immediately so the successful adults could finish their high-stakes negotiations without having to look at a failure. The silence that fell over the boardroom was absolute and heavy. It was not the silence of contemplation. It was the terrifying, suffocating silence of a bomb dropping into the center of a room and waiting for the fuse to burn down. The 5 elite executives sitting at the table did not look at me. They did not move to call security. They simply sat, frozen, staring at Richard with expressions of sheer, unadulterated disbelief. General Harrison slowly placed his hands flat on the black walnut table. The hardened military veteran looked at my father as if Richard had just suggested they try breathing underwater. The general jaw tightened, and a muscle feathered in his cheek. The sheer absurdity of a desperate, fraudulent beggar walking into their headquarters and demanding they terminate the supreme commander of the entire corporation was almost too much for the seasoned executive to process. General Harrison cleared his throat. The sound cut through the dead air of the boardroom like a cracking whip. He leaned forward, fixing Richard with a stare so cold it could have frozen a raging river. He spoke in a low, dangerous rumble, his voice carrying the full, crushing weight of reality. He apologized to my father, his tone entirely devoid of any actual regret. He stated very simply and very clearly that they could not fire me. Richard blinked rapidly, clearly believing he had misheard the general. "I am sorry," he asked, forcing an irritated laugh. "You cannot fire her." "Of course you can. She is standing in the back of a classified corporate briefing without identification. She has already disrupted one important event this week. Have security remove her, and we can continue discussing the contract." General Harrison remained motionless. "We cannot fire her," he repeated. Thomas threw up both hands. "Why not? Is she protected by some kind of veteran employment program?" Catherine let out another condescending laugh from the observer chairs. "That would explain everything. Riley has always known how to manipulate sympathy. She probably told your Human Resources Department some tragic story about her military discharge." Stella lifted her phone again, angling the camera toward me. "This is unbelievable," she whispered loudly to her followers. "Even major defense companies are afraid to fire incompetent people now." None of the executives reacted to her performance. General Harrison slowly pushed his chair away from the table and rose to his full height. One by one, the other 4 board members stood with him. Richard's expression changed. The movement was too coordinated to be accidental. These were not nervous employees preparing to escort an intruder from the room. They were senior military and corporate leaders standing with the rigid precision of officers receiving a superior commander. General Harrison turned away from my father. He faced me. "Madam Chairwoman," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the boardroom, "the floor is yours." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stared at the general. Thomas looked from one standing executive to another, his mouth hanging slightly open. Stella lowered her phone for the first time since entering the building. I unfolded my hands from behind my back and stepped out of the shadows. My heels struck the polished floor in a slow, steady rhythm as I crossed the room. No one spoke. No one tried to stop me. General Harrison moved away from the central chair at the head of the black walnut table and stood respectfully to its right. I stopped beside him. "Thank you, General." He gave me a crisp nod. I turned toward the board. "At ease." The 5 executives sat down immediately. My family remained standing. I took the chair at the head of the table, the seat Richard had spent the entire presentation trying to impress, and rested my hands lightly on the polished wood. Thomas finally found his voice. "What is happening?" I looked toward Naomi. "Display the corporate ownership structure." Naomi touched her secure tablet. The doctored financial charts behind Richard disappeared. In their place, the massive screens displayed the official organizational structure of Aegis Defense. At the top of the screen appeared a formal corporate photograph of me wearing a charcoal suit. Beneath it were 3 lines of bright white text. Riley Carter, Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Chairwoman and Controlling Shareholder, Technicians Aegis Defense. Below my name appeared the company's federal contracting credentials, international operating licenses, and authenticated corporate registration documents. A second panel displayed the ownership breakdown. My private trust controlled 82% of the voting shares. My signature appeared beneath every major acquisition Aegis had completed during the previous 4 years. Richard's face went completely blank. Stella stared at the screen as if she were waiting for it to change into something she could understand. Thomas gave a short, nervous laugh. "That is fake." No one joined him. He pointed at the display. "She works nights as a warehouse security guard. She lives in a studio apartment with broken furniture. She does not own a defense company." I leaned back in the executive chair. "You are correct about one thing, Thomas. I do maintain a studio apartment." His expression brightened for half a second, believing he had caught me in a contradiction. "It is a controlled, residential decoy," I continued. "I use it whenever I am forced to interact with people who believe financial information is an invitation to steal." The brief flicker of confidence vanished from his face. Catherine gripped the arms of her chair. "You lied to us. I protected myself from you." Richard shook his head violently. "No. This is impossible. A corporation of this size requires federal review, institutional backing, and military authorization. You could not have built this without anyone in Boston knowing." General Harrison's eyes hardened. "Everyone who needed to know was fully informed." He gestured toward the security credentials on the screen. "Captain Riley founded Aegis Defense using private capital and contracts developed through her international tactical network. Under her leadership, this company has completed operations in 23 countries and maintains active agreements with multiple branches of the United States government." He looked directly at Richard. "She did not receive her authority from Boston society pages." I touched the control panel embedded in the table. The screens changed again. Photographs appeared of me standing beside defense officials, military advisors, and international ministers. There were images from contract signings in Washington, strategic planning conferences in London, and secure government facilities Richard would never be permitted to enter. The final image showed the Aegis headquarters at night, its steel insignia illuminated high above the Boston skyline. The estimated corporate valuation appeared beneath it, $480 million. Stella's phone slipped from her fingers and struck the carpeted floor. The woman who had mocked my work as a security guard was staring at proof that I employed thousands of security professionals across the world. Catherine pressed one hand against her throat. "But your clothes," she whispered. "That apartment. The old car you used to drive when you visited us." "Costumes," I replied. The word landed harder than a shout. "You saw exactly what I wanted you to see. Every faded shirt, every worn pair of jeans, every carefully selected detail of that apartment served one purpose. It allowed me to observe thought I had nothing." I looked at each of them in turn. "You were given 4 years to show basic decency to a daughter you believed was poor and wounded. You failed every test." Thomas glanced down at his empty hand, remembering the coffee cup he had shoved against my chest in the lobby. His face tightened with humiliation. Richard stepped away from the podium. For the first time that morning, the performance of the powerful businessman disappeared. He looked older, smaller, and profoundly frightened. "You own the hotel too," he said suddenly. It was not a question. I smiled faintly. The engagement banquet was hosted by one of Aegis Hospitality's private properties. Catherine's face drained of color as she remembered the expensive champagne the ballroom and the manager who had demanded immediate payment after I left. Richard swallowed hard. "You froze my corporate credit line. I withdrew a privilege that was being abused." "And this contract," he asked, gesturing weakly toward the glossy presentation materials scattered across the table. "You invited here. I authorized your company to present a bid." A spark of desperate hope appeared in his eyes. Richard was incapable of processing relationships without searching for financial leverage. Within seconds, shock gave way to calculation. He straightened his tie, smoothed his suit jacket, and attempted to rebuild his smile. The transformation was almost impressive. My father had spent 32 years dismissing me as a failure. Now that he knew I controlled the only contract capable of saving his company, he was already trying to rewrite our entire history. He opened his arms slightly, presenting himself as a proud patriarch welcoming a successful child home. The terror in his eyes remained, but greed was stronger. Richard stood at the presentation podium, his face stretched into a grotesque, desperate smile. He clapped his hands together, his voice echoing with hollow joviality. He actually dared to call me his brilliant daughter, declaring that this was a wonderful family reunion and that we could simply skip the formalities and sign the $50 million contract right now. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulling out a designer pen as if General Harrison was going to slide the official paperwork across the table at any second. He looked around the room, expecting the executives to smile and play along with his sudden sickening display of paternal affection. I remained seated at the head of the table for a long moment. I looked at the man who had thrown me out of his house at 18 years old, the man who had humiliated me in front of hundreds of people just last night. He really thought he could smile his way out of a financial grave. He actually believed that biological ties would blind me to his blatant corruption. I stood up slowly. The room was so quiet you could hear the subtle hum of the digital displays on the walls. I picked up the thick, glossy portfolio Thomas had distributed to the board moments earlier. It was filled with vibrant stock photos and entirely fabricated revenue projections. I held it up so my father, my brother, and the entire executive board could see it. Then I opened my fingers and let it drop. The heavy folder hit the floor with a loud smack. The glossy pages slid out, scattering across the polished black marble floor like fallen leaves. Richard's fake smile completely collapsed. He stared at the mess on the floor, the color draining from his face, until he looked like a ghost. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping away any trace of emotion. I told him that Aegis Defense did not make $50 million deals based on glossy paper and blatant lies. I started listing the exact details of the financial audit my team had completed the night before. I cited his company's crippling debt-to-income ratio, the 3 illegal shell companies he was using to hide his failing assets, and the staggering amount of back taxes he currently owed the federal government. I watched him physically shrink behind the podium as I systematically exposed his fraudulent logistics network. I told the board and my terrified family that his transport trucks were severely outdated and failing basic safety inspections. I revealed that his employee turnover rate was a disaster because he routinely delayed payroll, and he had been late on critical delivery metrics for the past 16 consecutive months. Catherine gasped from the observer chairs, pressing a trembling hand to her chest as if she might faint from the shock of having their poverty exposed. Stella looked utterly lost, staring at her phone screen, as if waiting for a social media filter to somehow fix the nightmare unfolding around her. Her influencer status and designer bags meant absolutely nothing in a room governed by hard data and ruthless efficiency. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the black walnut table. I looked directly into my father's panicked, bloodshot eyes. I told him that I was the chief executive of a global defense conglomerate. I told him I was a businesswoman, not an orphanage for failed, incompetent men. I stated with absolute finality that his company was a massive liability, his proposal was a profound insult to my intelligence, and his bid was officially rejected. The words hung in the air heavy and inescapable. I had just delivered the death blow to his fragile empire. There was no appeal. There was no negotiation. He was finished. Richard seemed to lose all the strength in his legs. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium just to keep from collapsing to his knees. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to plead for a shred of mercy. But no sound came out. The reality of his absolute ruin had finally crushed the breath from his lungs. But Thomas was a different story. The cold rejection snapped something fundamental inside my brother. The thin veneer of a polished corporate professional shattered instantly, revealing the greedy, entitled bully hiding underneath. Thomas shoved his father aside, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He marched up to the conference table and slammed his fists down onto the wood so hard the sound echoed off the acoustic paneling. He screamed at me, his voice cracking with hysteria, completely ignoring the 5 elite military executives sitting just feet away. He called me a cold-blooded, ungrateful traitor. He demanded to know how I could sit on a multi-million-dollar throne while letting my own flesh and blood face absolute ruin and potential prison time. He shouted that this family had put a roof over my head and fed me when I was a child, and now I owed them my life. He cursed me, his face turning a deep, angry purple, screaming that I was hoarding my wealth out of sheer spite. He yelled that I had enough money to save their business 10 times over, and letting them go bankrupt was a disgusting, evil betrayal of everything a family was supposed to stand for. He acted as if my hard-earned corporate empire was simply a piggy bank meant to fund his lazy, luxurious lifestyle. General Harrison shifted in his seat, his large hands resting calmly on the table, entirely unbothered by my brother's violent tantrum. He glanced at me silently, asking for permission to have the armed security detail drag Thomas out of the building by his expensive collar. I gave the general a subtle shake of my head. I wanted to see exactly how far my brother was willing to dig his own grave. I looked at Thomas, completely unfazed by his screaming and table pounding. I told him that respect and loyalty were earned, not demanded through childish temper tantrums. I reminded him that just yesterday they were treating me like garbage on the bottom of their shoes, mocking my military service and trying to banish me from their sight. I told him that a failing business and total bankruptcy was exactly what he deserved for a lifetime of laziness, arrogance, and greed. Thomas breathed heavily, his chest heaving as he glared at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. He realized that begging and shouting were not going to break my composure. I was not the weak little sister he could bully into submission anymore. He took a step back from the table, a dark, desperate calculation, replacing the blind rage in his eyes. He turned around and walked back to his leather briefcase resting near the podium. He flipped the brass locks open with a sharp, aggressive click. He reached inside his hands, moving with frantic, reckless intent. He pulled out a thick, dark yellow manila folder. It looked old and weathered, secured with a tight string wrapped around a cardboard button. He held it up high in the air, his eyes locking onto mine with a sickening, triumphant gleam. He sneered, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register that sent a chill through the room. He told me that I had forced his hand. He claimed he wanted to handle this the easy way, as a family, but since I wanted to be ruthless, he was ready to play dirty. He marched back to the conference table and slapped the dark yellow folder onto the polished wood right in front of me. He stated that if I did not authorize that $50 million contract right now, he was going to walk straight out of this building and hand this folder to every major news outlet and defense blogger in the country. He promised me that what was inside that folder would permanently destroy my precious military reputation and burn Aegis Defense to the ground. The heavy manila folder sat on the black walnut table like a toxic artifact. Thomas rested his hands on the polished wood, leaning forward, so his face was only inches from mine. His breath smelled of stale coffee and panicked sweat, but his eyes were wide with the thrill of perceived victory. He untied the frayed string securing the flap and violently flipped the folder open. He pulled out a stack of papers stamped with fake red classification seals. He proudly announced that he had spent the last of his personal savings on the dark web to acquire my true military record. He tapped his finger aggressively against a heavily doctored document that looked like a crude imitation of a discharge paper. He claimed that this file proved I was not a hero. He stated that according to these documents, I had been dishonorably discharged for stealing military supplies, selling weapons on the black market, and abandoning my squad during an active firefight to save my own skin. He laughed, a sharp and cruel sound that bounced off the acoustic paneling. He told the Aegis executives sitting around the table that their brilliant CEO was a traitor and a thief. He threatened that if these documents reached the press, the scandal would cause Aegis Defense stock to plummet overnight. He gloated that the federal government would instantly revoke our security clearances and cancel billions in defense contracts. He promised that my entire corporate empire would turn to ash by morning if I did not give his logistics company the $50 million lifeline they demanded. The shift in the room was immediate. Richard, who had been gripping the podium like a man facing a firing squad, suddenly let out a massive sigh of relief. The color rushed back into his face. He smoothed the lapels of his overly flashy suit and walked over to stand shoulder to shoulder with his son. He clapped Thomas heavily on the back, praising his brilliant foresight. Richard looked at me with renewed arrogance, completely discarding the terror he had felt just moments before. He told me that I had left them no choice. He claimed that family had to stick together, and if I was going to be a stubborn, ungrateful child, they had to use a firm hand to teach me a lesson in loyalty. Catherine stood up from her observer chair, her high heels clicking loudly against the marble floor. She walked over to the table and looked down at me with an expression of profound, manufactured disappointment. She sighed dramatically, telling the room that she always knew I was a deceitful, troubled girl. She offered a fake, saccharine smile, stating that despite my horrific past and my criminal behavior in the military, the family was still willing to forgive me. She promised they would keep my dirty little secrets buried forever, provided I signed the contract immediately and authorized an upfront cash advance to clear their debts. Stella chimed in from her seat, aggressively chewing her gum. She crossed her arms and warned me not to test them. She bragged about her massive social media following, threatening to post the documents on all her platforms. She claimed she could ruin my life with a single click and destroy everything I had built if I did not hand over the money right now. They surrounded me like a pack of starving wolves, completely intoxicated by their own perceived power. They genuinely believed they had backed a billionaire defense contractor into a corner. They thought a fabricated file bought from a cheap internet scammer was enough to bring down the architect of a global security firm. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the terror they were so desperately hoping to see. I stood perfectly still, my posture relaxed, my hands resting lightly behind my back. I looked at Thomas with a profound, terrifying emptiness in my eyes. It was the exact same look I used when observing an enemy combatant making a fatal tactical error on the battlefield. I slowly turned my head away from my gloating family and looked at General Harrison. The seasoned military veteran was staring at Thomas with an expression of sheer, unadulterated disgust. The general knew my real operational record. He had personally reviewed the highly classified combat footage of my final mission before he ever agreed to work for me. Hearing a pathetic, greedy civilian accuse me of treason was deeply offensive to him. He shifted his broad shoulders on, silently waiting for my command to have the room cleared by force. I gave the general a subtle nod to stand down. I turned my attention to my executive assistant Naomi, who was standing quietly by the digital displays. I kept my voice measured, completely devoid of anger or panic. I told Naomi that Aegis Defense adhered to the absolute strictest federal compliance standards regarding corporate acquisitions and contract negotiations. I stated that under federal law, any negotiation involving a sum of $50 million that included aggressive ultimatums must be thoroughly documented for the company legal archives. I instructed her to activate the boardroom high-definition recording system and engage the primary security microphones. Naomi did not hesitate. She tapped a sequence of commands into her secure tablet. A soft chime echoed through the boardroom, and a series of subtle red lights illuminated along the ceiling panels and the center console of the walnut table. The room was now broadcasting crystal-clear audio and 4K resolution video directly to our secure, encrypted servers. Thomas scoffed, completely misunderstanding the situation. He leaned over the table, mocking me for trying to intimidate him with office technology. He claimed he did not care if I recorded the meeting because he held all the winning cards. He was so blinded by his own greed that he completely forgot he was standing inside a heavily monitored federal defense facility. I looked directly into the camera lens positioned above the digital display, then shifted my gaze back to my brother. I spoke clearly, ensuring every single syllable was captured by the high-grade microphones. I told Thomas that I needed him to clarify his exact terms for the official corporate record so I could properly weigh my options. I asked him to repeat precisely what he wanted from me and exactly what he intended to do if I refused his demands. It was a beautifully simple trap, and Thomas dove into it head first. He puffed out his chest, looking incredibly proud of himself. He pointed a finger directly at the camera, thinking he was showing off his dominance. He stated loudly and clearly that he was holding classified military documents proving my criminal history. He demanded that I sign the $50 million logistics contract immediately and wire an unrefundable $10 million advance to his father's shipping company by the end of the business day. He explicitly threatened that if I did not authorize the financial transfer, he would release the damaging documents to the global press to intentionally sabotage the stock value of Aegis Defense and ruin my corporate reputation. Richard nodded vigorously beside him, leaning into the microphone range to add his own voice to the recording. My father confirmed the ultimatum, stating that this was the price I had to pay for my freedom and that the family expected full compliance. They had just committed textbook federal extortion and corporate blackmail on a pristine, undeniable audio and video recording. They had handed me the absolute legal authority to destroy them in any court of law in the country. I looked at the glowing red light on the table. Then I looked back at my triumphant family. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment. I lowered my eyes, allowed my shoulders to slump a fraction of an inch, and let out a long, defeated sigh. I played the part of the broken, cornered victim to absolute perfection. I told them they had won. A collective gasp of joyous relief erupted from my family. Richard clapped his hands together, his face splitting into a massive, greedy grin. Catherine let out a shrill laugh, praising me for finally making a smart decision. Stella cheered from the sidelines, immediately pulling out her phone to start shopping for luxury handbags online. They began celebrating their victory, completely oblivious to the executioner blade hanging directly over their necks. I held up a hand to silence their pathetic celebration. I kept my eyes fixed on the table, projecting an aura of total surrender. I told them that if I was going to authorize a $50 million contract and a massive cash advance, I could not just sign the paperwork quietly in a back room. I stated that my executive board would demand a public display of corporate partnership to justify the sudden expenditure to our shareholders. I looked up at Richard, offering him a cold, calculated compromise. I reminded him that our family was hosting their highly publicized charity gala tomorrow night at the Grand Ballroom downtown. The event was supposed to be packed with local politicians, wealthy investors, and dozens of media outlets. I told my father to bring the contract to the gala. I promised him that if they wanted to play in the big leagues, we would do it right. I assured him that I would attend the event, step up onto the main stage, and sign the $50 million agreement live in front of the cameras and the press. Richard's eyes widened with absolute euphoria. The idea of securing a massive defense contract in front of all his wealthy peers and local media was a dream come true. It would instantly restore his ruined social standing and guarantee his company's survival. He did not hesitate for a single second. He eagerly agreed to the terms, promising to have the paperwork ready for the grand stage. He gathered his fraudulent yellow folder and marched his family out of the boardroom, utterly convinced they had just conquered the world. I watched the heavy glass doors seal shut behind them. General Harrison looked at me, a sharp, dangerous smile, finally breaking through his stoic expression. He asked if he should have the legal team prepare the extortion files for the authorities. I turned to face the general, my own smile mirroring his lethal intent. I told him to prepare the files, but to hold them until tomorrow night. My family wanted a public spectacle. They wanted the media to watch them succeed. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. Tomorrow night, I was going to burn their entire lives down to the bedrock on live television. The morning of the charity gala arrived with a bitter, biting chill that perfectly matched the atmosphere inside Aegis headquarters. I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows in my executive office, watching the gray city wake up, when Naomi walked in. She had a secure tablet clutched so tightly in her hands that her knuckles were entirely white. Her usual calm professional demeanor was fractured by a rare flash of genuine anger. She placed the tablet squarely on my black walnut desk and informed me that my brother had decided to fire his warning shot. I looked down at the illuminated screen. An anonymous article had just been published on one of the most prominent, high-traffic defense industry blogs in the country. The headline was printed in bold, aggressive lettering designed to incite absolute panic across the financial sector. It read, "Is the anonymous CEO of Aegis Defense a disgraced military deserter?" Thomas had leaked a heavily blurred, carefully cropped snippet of the forged discharge papers he bought on the dark web. He did not explicitly print my full name, but he provided just enough corporate breadcrumbs, operational dates, and vague military details to point a massive, glowing arrow directly at the executive leadership of my company. The reaction across the corporate landscape was immediate and violent. Naomi reported that our shareholder communication lines were lighting up like a switchboard in a crisis center. Major institutional investors were demanding immediate reassurance and clarity. Wall Street analysts were aggressively speculating on live television about a sudden leadership vacuum at the top of the defense contracting world. Our stock price had taken a slight but entirely noticeable dip within the first 2 hours of morning trading. Thomas was intentionally applying maximum psychological and financial pressure. He wanted to make absolutely certain that I was terrified, compliant, and completely ready to sign his $50 million lifeline on stage tonight. I handed the tablet back to Naomi with a steady, unbothered hand. She asked if our legal division should issue a swift, aggressive cease and desist order to the publication. She suggested we release a blanket denial from the board of directors to immediately calm the panicked markets. I shook my head, a cold, razor-sharp smile forming on my lips. I instructed her to do absolutely nothing. I ordered her to let the rumors spread like a wildfire. I wanted the tension to build to an explosive boiling point. The higher Thomas climbed on his precarious ladder of lies, the more bones he would break when I finally kicked it out from under him. I told Naomi to prepare my vehicle for the evening and left the office. Just as I stepped into my private elevator, my encrypted military line buzzed heavily in my pocket. I answered it immediately. It was David. His voice over the secure connection was completely different from the polite, accommodating tone he used whenever he was forced to be around my sister. This was the raw, unfiltered voice of a tactical commander executing a high-stakes operation. He asked me to meet him at a secure private location near the harbor in exactly 20 minutes. He stated with absolute urgency that he had something I was going to desperately need for my engagement tonight. I arrived at the designated waterfront plaza right on time. The area was completely deserted due to the freezing wind whipping off the gray harbor water. David was waiting for me by the heavy iron railing. The towering African-American Navy SEAL commander looked incredibly imposing in a dark wool overcoat, his broad posture radiating quiet, lethal discipline. He did not offer a polite greeting or attempt to engage in trivial small talk. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a heavy, military-grade encrypted USB drive. He held the small device out to me. The brushed metal was freezing cold against my palm as I took it from his grasp. I looked up at him, silently asking for confirmation of its contents. David held my gaze with absolute, unwavering respect. He explained that after the horrific display of disrespect at the engagement party, he had bypassed all the standard bureaucratic channels. He had used his high-level security clearance to contact the highest-ranking generals at the Department of Defense directly. He had informed them that a greedy civilian was attempting to blackmail a highly decorated war hero using forged, stolen valor documents bought on the internet. David's voice grew thick with fierce pride as he told me the response from the Pentagon had been immediate and unanimous. The Supreme Command had officially authorized the complete and total declassification of my actual combat record from the Korengal Valley. Every single redacted detail of my final bloody mission, every official commendation for supreme valor, and the undeniable classified proof of my sacrifice were loaded securely onto that drive. He gave me a crisp, sharp nod that conveyed 1,000 words of solidarity. He told me that the real soldiers, the ones who truly understood the crushing weight of the uniform, never forgot their benefactors. He said the military was stepping in to protect one of its own from domestic terrorists. I gripped the USB drive tightly in my fist, feeling a profound, overwhelming surge of gratitude for the honorable man my sister so carelessly tried to manipulate. I thanked him for his dedicated service and his unbreakable loyalty. David offered to stand right by my side on the gala stage tonight to personally vouch for the authenticity of the military documents. I politely but firmly declined his offer for direct physical intervention. I reminded him that this was my family and this was my personal execution to carry out. I told him his silent presence in the audience was all the tactical support I required. I returned to my secure, minimalist penthouse high above the city skyline to prepare for the evening. The charity gala was set to begin in exactly 3 hours. My family had aggressively demanded a public spectacle. They wanted me to bow down before their high society friends, their wealthy investors, and the flashing cameras of the local media. They wanted to humiliate me one final time while forcibly draining my corporate accounts to save their fraudulent, crumbling empire. They wanted a show, and I was going to give them a masterpiece. I walked into my expansive walk-in closet and completely bypassed the dark, muted business attire I usually wore to blend into the corporate background. Tonight, I was not hiding in the shadows or playing the part of the invisible executive. Tonight, I was the main event. I reached into the back of my wardrobe and pulled out a pristine, custom-tailored, blindingly white power suit. It was a garment that commanded absolute attention and projected an aura of untouchable, ruthless authority. It was the complete opposite of the pathetic, defeated, and dirty daughter they expected to see shuffling onto their stage. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror, adjusting the sharp, immaculate lapels of the white jacket. I picked up the encrypted USB drive from my vanity and slipped it securely into my inner breast pocket, resting right next to my heart. My family had spent my entire life wrapping themselves in a protective, suffocating cloak of hypocrisy, endless lies, and unearned privilege. They had built a castle out of deceit. I looked at my reflection one last time, my eyes burning with cold, hyper-focused intent. Tonight, I was going to walk onto their grand stage and burn their fake world entirely to ashes. The grand ballroom of Boston's most historic luxury hotel was a suffocating display of manufactured opulence. Richard had spared absolutely no expense for this charity gala. He had likely drained the last remaining pennies from his fraudulent offshore accounts to fund the extravagant floral arrangements, the towering ice sculptures, and the free-flowing premium champagne. This entire event was a desperate, glittering facade. It was meticulously designed to project a mirage of absolute financial stability to the wealthy investors, local politicians, and media outlets he needed to scam into saving his sinking logistics company. Catherine and Stella were holding court near the center of the room, completely intoxicated by the attention. They were draped in heavily sequined designer gowns that were undoubtedly rented or bought on high-interest credit. Stella was aggressively dragging David from one flashing camera lens to the next. The towering African-American Navy SEAL commander looked incredibly imposing in his formal dress uniform, his chest adorned with actual earned combat medals. He stood rigid and polite, playing the role of the devoted future son-in-law exactly as I had requested. He was the ultimate prop for their elaborate illusion. Every time a society photographer approached, Stella would cling to his arm, beaming brightly to project the image of a patriotic high society darling. She loudly introduced him to the city elite, using his prestigious military rank to validate her own shallow existence. She had absolutely no idea the honorable man she was holding on to was simply waiting for my signal to detonate her entire life. I stepped through the gilded double doors of the main entrance, the heavy fabric of my pristine white power suit moving with fluid, razor-sharp precision. The reaction to my arrival was instantaneous. The anonymous smear article Thomas had published on the defense blogs that morning had done its job perfectly. As I walked down the carpeted grand staircase, the polite murmuring chatter of the ballroom died down into a sharp, venomous wave of whispers. Hundreds of wealthy elites turned to stare at me, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity and manufactured outrage. I could feel their judgmental gazes burning into my back. To them, I was not a corporate CEO. Thanks to my brother Tactical Leak, I was the disgraced military deserter, the coward who had been exposed on the internet just hours ago for abandoning her team. The wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea, stepping away from me as if my mere presence might contaminate their pristine social standing. I kept my head held high, my expression completely devoid of shame or fear. From across the room, David caught my eye. Over the heads of the whispering crowd, the SEAL commander gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod of absolute solidarity. He was ready. I had barely reached the edge of the main dance floor when Richard and Thomas deliberately blocked my path. They moved in perfect synchronization, their faces flushed with the intoxicating thrill of their perceived victory. Richard was practically vibrating with greed. He gave me a sickeningly sweet paternal smile designed specifically for the watching crowd, but his eyes were completely dead, ruthless, and devoid of any actual humanity. Thomas stepped forward, blocking my path, to the center of the room. He held a sleek black leather portfolio tightly against his chest. He did not bother lowering his voice. He wanted the nearby investors and society gossips to hear him taking absolute control of the disgraced daughter. He pulled out the $50 million Aegis Defense subcontract, complete with the authorization forms for a $10 million immediate cash advance to clear their debts. He shoved a heavy gold pen directly into my hand, pressing the sharp point into my palm. He leaned in close, the smell of expensive bourbon on his breath. He whispered through gritted teeth that I had played a decent game of corporate dress-up, but it was officially over. He gloated that the entire room already knew what a fraudulent coward I was. He explicitly threatened that if I did not sign the document right now, he would release the rest of the fake military files to the journalists waiting by the open bar. Richard stepped up beside him, adjusting his tie and offering a cold, victorious smirk. My father told me quietly that the cameras were watching. He ordered me to sign the paper, hand over the corporate advance, and quietly slip out the back door before I embarrassed the family name any further. They genuinely believed the intense public pressure, combined with the morning media smear campaign, had completely broken my resolve. They thought I was a cornered animal, desperate to buy their silence. I looked down at the $50 million extortion demand resting in my trembling hands. I looked at my father, who was nodding encouragingly, entirely ready to pose for the cameras the second my ink hit the paper, to prove he had secured a massive government contract. I did not take the gold pen. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not lower my eyes. Instead, I reached out and slapped the bottom of the leather portfolio with a sharp, violent upward strike. The heavy contract flew into the air, its thick, glossy pages ripping out of the binder and scattering across the polished ballroom floor like worthless trash. Thomas gasped, stumbling backward in shock as the papers rained down around his expensive shoes. Richard's face went completely pale, his victorious smile shattering into an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. Before either of them could even register the absolute defiance of my refusal, I turned my back on them. I reached out and took a crystal flute of champagne from the silver tray of a passing waiter. I picked up a solid silver dessert spoon from a nearby catering station. I stepped directly into the center of the room, right under the massive crystal chandelier. I raised the glass high into the air and tapped the silver spoon against the fragile crystal. At my feet lay the scattered, glossy pages of the $50 million defense contract. Thomas stared down at the ruined documents, his jaw slack with disbelief. He had played his ultimate hand, and I had swatted it away like it was absolutely nothing. But Richard was a cornered animal. My father realized in a split second that his quiet, coercive blackmail attempt had completely failed. The private extortion in the shadows was over. He was drowning in debt, standing in front of the very investors he needed to scam, and the only lifeline he had left was currently scattered across the polished marble floor. Panic, raw and unfiltered, seized his features. If he could not force me to sign the contract privately, he was going to destroy me publicly. Richard shoved past his son, abandoning the ruined paperwork. His face was flushed a violent, angry red. He practically sprinted up the carpeted steps to the main presentation stage at the front of the ballroom. He lunged for the microphone standing at the center of the podium. He ripped it from the stand with such force that the speakers let out a sharp, agonizing screech of feedback, making several guests in the front row cover their ears. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at me. He did not hesitate to weaponize his own flesh and blood to save his fraudulent empire. He shouted into the microphone, his voice booming across the cavernous room. He addressed the wealthy elites, the corporate investors, and the flashing lenses of the local media. He put on the performance of a lifetime, his voice cracking with manufactured heartbreak and righteous fury. He declared that I was a completely unfilial, deceitful daughter. He claimed that I had arrived at their charity gala tonight with the sole intention of destroying my own family out of pure psychotic spite. He shouted that I was actively threatening to maliciously bankrupt his honorable logistics company just to feed my own massive ego. The crowd gasped, a collective wave of shock rippling through the high society guests. But Richard did not stop there. He leaned closer into the microphone, his eyes blazing with a toxic, desperate triumph. He decided to play the fake military narrative for the entire world to hear. He announced to the horrified ballroom that I was a complete disgrace. He shouted that I was a coward who had been dishonorably kicked out of the armed forces for abandoning my post when the gunfire got too heavy. He pointed his finger at me again, declaring that I was a curse upon their pristine family name and a total fraud who deserved to be shunned by polite society. Right on cue, Stella launched into her supporting act down on the main floor. The golden child did not miss a single beat. She collapsed against a nearby cocktail table, bursting into loud, dramatic, heaving sobs. She buried her face in her hands, crying hysterically about how I had already ruined her engagement party the night before, and now I was trying to destroy their charity gala. Catherine rushed to her side, wrapping her arms protectively around Stella. My mother glared at me with absolute venom, shouting that I was a monster who needed to be locked away. David stood just a few feet away from them. The Navy SEAL commander remained perfectly rigid, his face an impenetrable mask of military stoicism. He watched the pathetic, manufactured tragedy unfold exactly as I had told him it would. He did not intervene. He simply stood with his hands clasped behind his back, waiting for my command. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic frenzy. Media cameras flashed blindingly, capturing every second of the ultimate high society scandal. Journalists frantically typed on their phones, ready to publish the story of the heroic, desperate father defending his business against his unhinged, traitorous daughter. The narrative was perfectly set in their favor. I did not shout back. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer a single desperate word of defense. I calmly handed my crystal champagne flute back to a terrified, wide-eyed waiter passing by. I reached up and smoothly adjusted the lapels of my pristine white power suit. Then I began the long, deliberate walk toward the main stage. The crowd parted for me, immediately stepping back as if I were a ghost. The silence that followed my footsteps was thick with electric anticipation. I climbed the carpeted stairs with a steady, unhurried cadence. Richard instinctively took a physical step backward as I reached the top of the stage. The microphone trembled violently in his sweaty grip. His eyes darted nervously, realizing that my complete lack of fear was not the reaction he had anticipated. I did not even look at my father. I walked straight past him, leaving him standing uselessly at the podium. I headed directly for the audiovisual technician booth, situated just off the right wing of the stage. The lead technician looked up at me, his eyes wide with panic amid the ongoing corporate disaster. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer. I pulled out a sleek silver data drive containing the heavily encrypted files extracted directly from the Aegis defense servers. I placed it firmly onto the technician control board. I leaned in and instructed him in a cold, authoritative tone to override the venue presentation feed immediately and broadcast file number 1. Down on the dance floor, Thomas saw me hand over the drive. He suddenly panicked, his arrogance replaced by sudden dread. He yelled out to the crowd, pointing wildly at the stage. He screamed that I was about to show them fabricated lies. He shouted that I was trying to manipulate the audience with fake corporate presentations. But his frantic shouts were completely drowned out. The massive wall-to-wall digital screens positioned behind the main stage flickered. The bright gala logos vanished entirely. The high-definition image that suddenly filled the room was not the pixelated fake military discharge papers Thomas had threatened to release. It was not a corporate slideshow. Instead, the massive screens broadcasted crystal-clear 4K resolution security footage. The camera angle looked down from the ceiling, displaying the polished black walnut table of the Aegis Defense Executive Boardroom. The timestamp glowing brightly in the bottom corner clearly displayed yesterday date. The audio kicked in, bypassing the podium microphone and echoing flawlessly through the ballroom state-of-the-art surround sound system. It was the undeniable, booming voice of my brother Thomas. The entire gala watched in stunned, breathless silence as the towering screens showed Thomas leaning aggressively over the boardroom table. They heard his voice crisp and clear, violently threatening to leak fake military documents and ruin my reputation if I did not instantly wire a $10 million cash advance to his fraudulent company. Richard's own voice echoed next through the high-definition speakers, eagerly agreeing to the extortion and confirming the blackmail attempt. The entire room stood paralyzed as the absolute, undeniable proof of their federal crimes played out on a 50-foot screen for the entire world to see. The video finished playing. The frozen image on the 50-foot screen was Thomas and his face distorted by pure, ugly greed. The crisp audio of his extortion demand still seemed to bounce off the crystal chandeliers. For 5 seconds, the grand ballroom of the luxury hotel was locked in a vacuum of stunned horror. Then the dam broke. A collective wave of absolute disgust washed over the crowd. Wealthy investors, prominent politicians, and high society elites began to murmur, their voices rising in a sharp crescendo of revulsion. The flashing cameras of the local media immediately shifted their focus away from the stage and pointed directly at Thomas and Richard on the dance floor. The narrative had flipped instantly. Richard was no longer the heroic, desperate father defending his honorable business. He was a documented federal criminal caught orchestrating a $10 million blackmail scheme on tape. Thomas took a stumbling step backward. His mouth opened and closed, but he had absolutely no defense. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. Richard looked like he had just been struck by lightning. The arrogant flush had completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Over by the cocktail tables, Catherine and Stella instantly stopped their theatrical crying. Their fake tears dried up the second they realized the entire room was looking at them with unadulterated contempt. Before the chaotic murmurs could escalate into a roar, a heavy, rhythmic sound cut through the noise. It was the sound of polished leather boots striking the marble floor with precise military discipline. The crowd instinctively parted, creating a wide, clear path down the center of the ballroom. David strode forward. The towering African-American Navy SEAL commander had shed his civilian tuxedo. He was now dressed in his pristine, formal Navy dress uniform. Golden stripes wrapped around his sleeves, and a heavy cluster of actual earned combat medals gleamed brilliantly against the dark fabric across his chest. He radiated an aura of absolute, lethal authority. He did not look at Stella. He did not even glance at the woman he was supposed to marry. His eyes were locked dead ahead. David walked up the carpeted stairs of the main stage with a steady, unhurried cadence. He approached the podium and took the microphone in his large hand. He stood beside me, a solid wall of righteous power. He looked out over the sea of shocked faces and the trembling members of my family down below. When David spoke, his voice boomed through the speakers, carrying the unquestionable command of a man who led elite soldiers into the darkest corners of the earth. He pointed a steady, accusatory finger down at Richard and Thomas. He told the entire ballroom that this family had just stood on this stage and called their own daughter a coward. He stated that they had shamelessly branded her a deserter and a disgrace to the uniform she wore. David and his voice grew dangerously low, vibrating with suppressed fury. He announced that, as an active Special Operations commander, he refused to let those sickening lies stand for a single second longer. He declared to the hushed crowd that he had personally contacted the highest levels of the Pentagon. He proudly announced that the Department of Defense had officially authorized the complete and total declassification of my combat record. He told the media to turn their cameras back to the stage and record every single word he was about to say. David and his voice rang out with fierce, undeniable pride. He proclaimed that former Captain Riley was not a deserter. He revealed the absolute truth of the Korengal Valley. He explained that my squad of 6 had been ambushed and pinned down by 50 heavily armed insurgents. He told the silent, captivated audience that I was the only one who stayed behind. He described how I manually held the defensive line, intentionally drawing heavy enemy fire to myself so my squad and 65 innocent civilians could evacuate to safety. He looked down at Richard, his eyes burning with disgust. He told my father that the severe, jagged scar on my wrist was not a mark of shame. He stated that the wound was the exact price I paid to buy the freedom of the people I was sworn to protect. He declared that I had bled on foreign soil to defend the very rights my family was currently using to extort and humiliate me. David reached into the breast pocket of his immaculate dress uniform. He pulled out a small rectangular box wrapped in deep red velvet. He turned to face me directly, standing at absolute attention. He opened the velvet box to reveal a heavy bronze medal suspended from a navy blue and white ribbon. It was the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. David spoke softly, his words meant for me, but amplified for the entire room to hear. He said that the military never forgets its true heroes. He presented the medal to me, offering a crisp, sharp salute that conveyed 1,000 words of profound respect and solidarity. The reaction from the ballroom was instantaneous and deafening. The wealthy elites, the corporate investors, and the journalists erupted into a massive, thunderous standing ovation. The applause shook the crystal chandeliers overhead. People were cheering, wiping tears from their eyes, completely overwhelmed by the raw, undeniable truth of my sacrifice. Down on the floor, my family was physically crumbling under the crushing weight of their exposure. Thomas sank to his knees, clutching his head in his hands as the reality of his federal crimes and public destruction set in. Richard staggered sideways, leaning heavily against a cocktail table just to keep himself from collapsing onto the marble. Catherine and Stella were shrinking into the shadows, trying desperately to hide their faces from the relentless flashing cameras documenting their absolute ruin. They were paralyzed, utterly destroyed by the truth. I stood on the stage, the Navy Cross resting heavy and cold in my palm. The deafening applause continued to roll through the grand ballroom like thunder. I let them cheer for a few moments longer. Then I slowly raised my free hand into the air. The commanding gesture instantly quieted the massive crowd. The applause died down to a hushed electric silence. I looked down at my terrified, shattered family. I leaned into the microphone and my voice perfectly calm and razor-sharp. I told the audience to hold their applause. I stated that the extortion attempt they just witnessed was simply a desperate distraction. I looked directly into my father and his panicked eyes and promised the room that the show was not over yet. I declared that the true depths of their depravity, their actual unforgivable crimes against their own employees, were hidden in the very next file. I turned back to the audiovisual booth. I gave the lead technician a single sharp nod. I told him to execute the final sequence. The massive digital screens behind me blinked. The security footage of Thomas and his pathetic extortion attempt vanished. In its place, a dizzying, complex labyrinth of financial documents illuminated the grand ballroom. High-definition scans of certified bank statements, forged tax returns, and heavily encrypted offshore account ledgers flooded the 50-foot displays. Red circles and stark yellow highlights began to appear on the screen, tracking the movement of massive sums of money in real time. The wealthy elites and corporate investors in the audience leaned forward, their eyes scanning the data. I did not leave them in suspense. I raised the microphone and began to dissect the anatomy of my family and their decade-long financial treason. I projected my voice with absolute, unwavering authority. I told the crowd that Richard Logistics Company was not bleeding capital due to a struggling economy or market fluctuations. I explained that the company was dying because my father and my brother had been systematically, intentionally bleeding it dry like parasites for the better part of 10 years. I pointed to the sprawling spreadsheets on the screen behind me. I directed the audience and their attention to a specific column of numbers. I revealed the darkest, most unforgivable truth of their entire operation. I stated that Richard and Thomas had not just skimmed corporate profits or falsified operational expenses. They had reached directly into the pockets of their own workforce. I announced to the horrified ballroom that my father and brother had been illegally siphoning millions of dollars out of their employee pension funds. A loud, collective gasp rippled through the high society crowd. Stealing from investors was a corporate crime, but stealing the retirement funds of blue-collar workers was a moral depravity that disgusted everyone in the room. I kept my voice cold and surgical. I explained that the truck drivers, the warehouse managers, and the administrative staff who had dedicated decades of their lives to building my father and his company were now facing absolute financial ruin. Their retirement accounts were empty. Their futures had been completely erased. I did not let Catherine and Stella shrink into the shadows. I demanded the technician pull up the corresponding expenditure reports. The screens shifted again, displaying a terrifyingly clear paper trail. I linked the stolen pension money directly to the lavish, extravagant lifestyle my mother and sister flaunted so proudly. I told the media to point their cameras at Catherine. I explained that her exotic vacations, her unearned diamond necklaces, and her luxury vehicles were all purchased with the stolen wages of hard-working families. I turned my attention to Stella, who was trembling violently against a cocktail table. I exposed her entire social media influencer lifestyle as a fraudulent illusion. I revealed that her trips to Paris, her designer wardrobes, and this very extravagant engagement party we were currently standing in were all entirely funded by federal tax evasion and corporate embezzlement. The pristine, expensive gowns my mother and sister were wearing right now were quite literally woven from the stolen futures of innocent people. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted from shocked silence to pure, unadulterated outrage. The investors who Richard had been desperately trying to scam just hours ago were now staring at him with a hatred so intense it was almost palpable. The journalists were furiously snapping photos of the financial evidence on the screens, already drafting the headlines that would destroy my family and their legacy forever. Down on the dance floor, Thomas finally realized there was no escape. The arrogant bully who had threatened to ruin my life just yesterday was now completely paralyzed by his own impending doom. He took a stumbling step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the gilded exit doors at the back of the room. He turned to run, desperate to flee the consequences of his actions. He did not make it more than 5 steps. The crowd of wealthy guests, prominent politicians, and outraged citizens formed a solid, impenetrable wall of bodies. They completely blocked his path, glaring at him with supreme contempt. Thomas was trapped. Richard did not even try to run. My father's legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto his knees on the polished marble floor. He grasped his chest, hyperventilating loudly, his eyes wide and vacant. He stared up at the massive screens displaying his federal crimes, finally, understanding that his entire life, his business, and his precious reputation were permanently, irrevocably destroyed. Right on cue, a piercing, deafening sound shattered the cold Boston night outside. The wail of federal sirens echoed through the historic streets, growing louder and more urgent by the second. The flashing red and blue lights of law enforcement vehicles illuminated the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom, casting a frantic strobe light effect over the terrified faces of my family. The heavy gilded doors at the main entrance were thrown open with violent force. A tactical squad of federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation marched into the ballroom. They wore dark jackets emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of their agency. They moved with absolute terrifying precision. My legal team at Aegis Defense had handed them the complete, undeniable audit report hours ago. They already had the arrest warrant signed by a federal judge. The agents descended on the dance floor, parting the crowd with effortless authority. They surrounded Richard and Thomas. The harsh, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the quieted room. An agent grabbed Thomas by the arms, twisting them behind his back and locking the cuffs into place. My brother began sobbing uncontrollably, the arrogant extortionist replaced by a terrified, blubbering child. He begged the agents for a lawyer, his voice cracking with sheer panic as they read him his Miranda rights. 2 other agents hauled Richard up from the floor by his armpits. My father offered absolutely no resistance. His eyes were completely glassy, his mind entirely broken by the sheer velocity of his downfall. He looked like an empty shell of a man as the cold steel locked around his wrists. The flashing cameras of the press captured every single humiliating second of their arrest, broadcasting their total destruction to the entire world. David stood firmly on the stage beside me, his arms crossed over his decorated chest. The Navy SEAL commander watched the criminals being hauled away with an expression of profound righteous satisfaction. He had wanted to see justice served, and I had delivered it on a silver platter. As the federal agents began marching Richard and Thomas toward the exit, Catherine completely lost the last remaining shred of her manufactured sanity. The realization that her wealth, her husband, and her social standing were evaporating before her very eyes drove her into a state of sheer manic desperation. She let out a shrill, agonizing scream. She abandoned Stella and rushed the stage, practically crawling up the carpeted stairs. She tripped over the hem of her stolen designer gown, tearing the expensive fabric, but she did not care. She threw herself onto the floor, right in front of me. Catherine fell to her knees, her perfectly styled hair falling into a messy, chaotic tangle around her tear-streaked face. She reached out and grabbed my legs, her manicured fingers digging desperately into the fabric of my white power suit. She sobbed hysterically, abandoning every single ounce of her pride and dignity in front of the flashing cameras. She begged me for mercy. She wailed, pleading with me to call off the federal agents. She screamed that I had enough power and money to make this all go away. She cried out that she was my mother, begging me to save them from prison and total ruin. She promised she would do anything I wanted, apologizing frantically for throwing me out, for treating me like a failure, and for allowing Richard to steal the money. She begged me to use my corporate empire to protect her. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life manipulating me, belittling my achievements, and treating me like a disposable burden. I looked at the tears ruining her expensive makeup, tears she only shed because she was finally facing the consequences of her own horrific actions. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I did not feel any lingering daughterly affection. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, clean air of absolute justice. I looked down at her grasping hands. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, forcing her fingers to slip away from my suit. I looked her dead in the eyes, my voice dropping to a low, freezing whisper that carried through the microphone for the entire ballroom to hear. I told her that her tears could not save this house anymore. 2 federal agents stepped onto the stage and pulled Catherine away from me. She fought them for several seconds, reaching desperately in my direction and screaming that I was destroying my own family. Her torn gown dragged across the carpet as the agents escorted her down the stairs. I did not answer. The cameras followed her every movement. At the bottom of the stage, Stella stood completely alone. Her engagement celebration had disappeared. The photographers who had spent the evening documenting her designer gown and military fiancé were now recording her connection to stolen pension money, corporate fraud, and federal extortion. She looked toward David. For the first time since the agents entered the ballroom, genuine fear appeared in her eyes. She rushed toward him and wrapped both hands around his arm. "David, please," she said. "You know I had nothing to do with any of this." He looked down at her hands, but did not respond. Stella spoke faster. "My father and Thomas handled the company. I never saw the financial records. I did not know where the money came from. They lied to me, too." David slowly removed her hands from his sleeve. "You knew enough." Her face tightened. "What is that supposed to mean?" "You knew your sister had served honorably." Stella shook her head. "No, I did not. Dad told us she ran away. You watched me recognize her scar. You heard me explain that she stayed behind to save her squad. You saw the challenge coin. You knew I was not joking." Stella's eyes darted toward the cameras. That was confusing. Everyone was emotional. "You were not confused when you uploaded a video accusing Riley of being mentally unstable." Her mouth opened, but no explanation came. David continued, his voice controlled and devastatingly calm. "You were not confused this morning when Thomas published forged military records. You did not ask him to stop. You brought those lies into this ballroom and stood beside your family while they tried to force Riley to hand over $50 million. "I was protecting us," Stella whispered. "No, you were protecting the lifestyle you believed they could provide." The words stripped away the final layer of her performance. Stella reached for him again. "I love you." David stepped back. "You love what my uniform does for your image." A murmur moved through the crowd. Stella's face crumpled. "That is not true." David looked toward the massive screens still displaying the financial trail connecting stolen pension funds to her vacations, clothing, and engagement party. "Every photograph you posted was paid for by someone who believed they were saving for retirement. Every gown, hotel suite, and first-class ticket came from employees your family betrayed." He reached for her left hand. For 1 second, Stella believed he was comforting her. Instead, he removed the diamond engagement ring from her trembling finger. The ballroom went completely silent. David placed the ring on the nearest cocktail table. "I would rather spend the rest of my life alone than marry a woman who mistakes cruelty for loyalty." Stella let out a broken gasp. David's expression did not change. "This engagement is over. Do not call me. Do not contact my command. Do not use my name in another video sponsorship or business proposal." He turned away from her and walked toward the stage. Stella stood frozen beside the abandoned ring, while hundreds of cameras recorded the complete destruction of the future she had planned. The hotel manager approached Catherine with a security team and a final invoice. The family's corporate credit line had been frozen, and every private account connected to Richard's logistics company was under federal review. Catherine stared at the total. The gala, The engagement party, the luxury suites, and the emergency security response had generated a bill larger than the remaining balance in her personal accounts. She tried to protest. The manager informed her that she and Stella had 15 minutes to collect their personal belongings before they were removed from the hotel. For the first time in their lives, no one cared that they considered themselves important. The ballroom emptied slowly. Investors avoided Catherine as if she carried a contagious disease. Politicians who had posed for photographs with Richard less than an hour earlier ordered their aides to remove every image from social media. Sponsors began terminating Stella's contracts before she even left the building. I remained on the stage until the last federal agent escorted Richard and Thomas through the doors. My father looked back once. There was no apology in his expression, only disbelief that the daughter he had discarded possessed the power to let justice proceed without rescuing him. 3 months later, Richard and Thomas entered guilty pleas in federal court. The evidence from the Aegis boardroom recording was impossible to challenge. Their voices were captured clearly, demanding a $50 million contract and a $10 million advance in exchange for suppressing forged military documents. The financial audit was even more devastating. Federal prosecutors traced 10 years of pension theft, tax fraud, falsified investor reports, and offshore transfers. The money had moved through shell companies before funding luxury vehicles, international vacations, designer clothing, and property purchases controlled by Catherine and Stella. Richard received 15 years in federal prison. Thomas received 13 years after agreeing to testify against several outside accountants who had helped conceal the stolen funds. Neither sentence could restore the years their employees had lost, but the bankruptcy court placed the workers first. Under an agreement negotiated by Aegis Defense's legal division, every legitimate truck warehouse distribution contract and real estate asset belonging to Richard's company was transferred into a protected recovery trust. The proceeds were not given to investors. They were returned to the drivers' dispatchers, warehouse supervisors, and administrative employees whose retirement accounts had been emptied. I contributed additional private capital to stabilize the fund, but I did so anonymously. The workers did not need to thank me. They had earned that money. Catherine escaped criminal charges because prosecutors could not prove she understood the exact mechanics of the pension theft. But the civil courts showed her no mercy. Every property purchased with stolen corporate money was seized. Her primary residence was sold. Her vehicles were repossessed. The jewelry she had worn to the gala was catalogued as recoverable property and auctioned to reimburse the pension trust. The women who once gathered around her at country club lunches stopped returning her calls. Without the house, the cars, or Richard's stolen money, Catherine became invisible to the society she had spent her life trying to impress. She and Stella moved into a narrow 2-bedroom apartment in an industrial neighborhood outside Boston. It was only a few streets away from the decoy studio they had mocked when they believed I lived there. Stella's collapse was even faster. Every major sponsor canceled its agreement with her. Luxury brands issued public statements denying any relationship with her family. The platform that hosted most of her content suspended her account after investigators confirmed that she had used forged military records to target a decorated veteran. Her millions of followers disappeared as quickly as they had arrived. Without sponsors' stolen pension money or a prestigious fiancé, Stella had no income capable of supporting the image she had created. The diamond engagement ring was sold through the recovery trust. Its proceeds went to a warehouse employee named Maria, whose pension account had been emptied 6 months before she planned to retire. I never contacted Stella. Occasionally, a blocked number attempted to reach my private phone. I never answered. 6 months after the gala, I stood on the rooftop terrace of Aegis Defense headquarters. The Boston skyline stretched beneath me, illuminated by the deep orange light of sunset. The wind moved gently across the steel and glass tower, carrying none of the noise that had once followed me through every family gathering. Inside the executive conference room, my board had just approved the largest humanitarian defense contract in Aegis history. We were building a secure logistics network capable of delivering medical supplies into disaster zones where ordinary carriers could not operate. The project would employ hundreds of veterans and former emergency responders. Naomi stepped through the glass doors carrying a tray of coffee. General Harrison followed her, accompanied by 4 members of my old Marine unit. I had not seen all of them together since the operation in the Korengal Valley. They were older now. Some carried visible scars. Others moved with the careful posture of people who had learned to live with injuries the world could not see. But they were alive. That was all that mattered. David joined us last. He was not wearing his dress uniform. He wore a simple dark suit, carrying himself with the same quiet discipline that had first made him recognize the truth my family refused to see. He handed me a black presentation folder. Inside was the final Pentagon authorization for the new medical logistics project. "Congratulations, Captain," he said. "I have not been a captain for years." David smiled. Some ranks do not disappear just because the paperwork changes. General Harrison lifted his coffee cup. "To the Black Panther." My former squad members raised their cups with him. I looked around the terrace. These people had never demanded that I shrink myself to protect their egos. They had never treated my strength as a threat or my loyalty as something they were entitled to exploit. They respected the woman I was not, the version of me they could control. For most of my life, I believed family was something assigned at birth, a permanent obligation, tied together by blood guilt and shared history. I understood the truth now. Family was the person who held the extraction point while you carried the wounded. Family was the commander who defended your name when silence would have been easier. Family was the colleague who challenged your decisions without questioning your worth. Family was chosen through loyalty, integrity, and action. I walked to the edge of the terrace and rested my hands against the steel railing. Far below, the city moved in streams of headlights and shifting shadows. Somewhere beyond those streets, Catherine and Stella were living with the consequences of the world they had built. Richard and Thomas were beginning years of confinement, created entirely by their own greed. I felt no need to celebrate their suffering. Their absence was enough. For the first time in 32 years, there was no one standing behind me insisting I was a failure. No one was demanding my money, my silence, or my surrender. I was not the unwanted guest seated beside the kitchen doors. I was not the frightened 18-year-old carrying a duffel bag into the rain. I was not the wounded Marine whose classified sacrifice allowed cruel people to invent their own story. I was Riley Carter, founder of Aegis Defense, commander of my own future. I raised my coffee toward the skyline. "They threw me to the wolves," I said. David, Naomi Harrison, and my old squad stood beside me. A slow smile crossed my face. What they never realized was that I was the leader of the pack. The events that unfolded on that gala stage taught me a profound lesson about the true nature of loyalty and family. For 32 years, I was conditioned to believe that blood bound us to a lifetime of silent obligation. Society constantly tells us that no matter how deep the wounds, family is family. But as I watched my parents and brother face the devastating consequences of their own greed, I realized that blood is simply a biological fact, not a free pass for systematic abuse. Respect and protection must be earned. When you are constantly cast as the scapegoat, it is dangerously easy to internalize the narrative that you are the problem. You shrink yourself to fit into their conditional boxes of approval. But the exact moment I stopped seeking their validation, I reclaimed my absolute power. I learned that true strength does not come from endlessly forgiving those who tear you down. It comes from drawing an immovable boundary. Sometimes The most empowering thing you can do is let the toxic bridge burn and use the light of those flames to forge your own independent path forward. My real family was never the people who shared my last name. It was the soldiers who stood by my side in the darkest valleys, the colleagues who respected my intellect, and the honorable people who recognized truth over superficial status. I built my empire out of a fierce, unyielding dedication to my own worth. You cannot heal in the very same environment that broke you, and you absolutely do not owe your success to the people who actively prayed for your downfall. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace, please share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more journeys of reclaiming your power.